will do a short introduction, and then we can start immediately. Hello, everyone, and welcome to your first, or I think 9th time of Reading Club, or 10th time. We're PRI Collaborative, which is Eugenia, Benedict, and me, and we founded Reading Club in February this year as a possibility to have the discourse which we're dearly missing from either office or academia, and from all our international friends, and to bring this to Zoom and to share it online. And in the course of the events, we've been inviting people who we think are especially relevant to today's discourse. So in the past, for example, we've had Klaus Platzkummer from TU Berlin, and he's an assistant at PRI002 in London. He was talking about Willem Flusser, or we've had Jan Kamsov, professor from TU Berlin, who was talking about how to have an exhibition whilst being very young, on young practices in Europe. And tonight we're having the special pleasure of a very interesting and relevant topic of inviting Angelika Hinterbrandner, who's been working in this field or researching on these topics for actually some years now, no? It's been some years already.
Yeah, that's true.
Can I introduce you, or do you want to introduce yourself?
No, please go. I'm curious.
So I hope to remember everything correctly. You were initially, Angelika was initially studying at TU Graz, where she's finished bachelor's and master's, I think.
No, that's not true. I didn't finish my master's there.
I didn't finish a master's there. Ah. Okay, sorry. So she started in Graz anyway, but which is it's more relevant that she's been working at international companies. So she's been at Buchner Bru in Basel, at MVRDV in Rotterdam, and she's been working at Arc Plus, among others, in Berlin, which is also one of the topics which we're going to talk about today. There have been two very relevant issues, which form a main body of today's presentation, today's discussion. And currently she's editor, is that correct, at kntxtr, or contributor of kntxtr and of Cartha magazine, if that's still correct. And she's also working in press relations for and doing the communications for the German Pavilion.
No, that's wrong.
That's wrong.
First, I'm unfortunately not working with, or like I'm only partially contributing to Cartha.
Okay.
At the moment, because I am involved in too many different projects currently, and I'm working mainly with Brandlhuber Plus, what is kind of like including 2038, and I'm working for 2038 as well, but only on a very, only a very small part of my work. So mainly I'm in the office and working on content. As I guess everyone knows, Brandlhuber Plus is involved in quite some activist and in content work as well. So I'm responsible for that in the office at the moment. And that's, enough work, I'd say.
Yeah, somehow lost sight because there were so many projects you've been involved with. And I've seen a research interest in so many topics. And we're especially looking forward to tonight to hear about this topic from you.
Yeah, one thing I would like to add on, as I mentioned before, that I didn't finish my, but I started another master's degree in leadership in digital innovation, which is quite a buzzwordy-ish master's degree, but it's quite interesting and shows as well that I kind of like moved into this digital sphere a bit more, or let's say as well in the entrepreneurial direction. So I'm scattered with interests and where I'm working, but I enjoy that very much. And I think I'll just jump right into the discussions, besides there's anything from anyone else that we need to know before we start. Can I start?
Yeah. Just whilst Angelika is speaking, guys, just mute so we don't get any feedback or anything. Thanks.
So I picked the topic politics of space and data, and as most of you might have, oh no, okay, I'm jumping quickly. might know from the email already, or with the issue as well as with the video that I picked as a content piece, I found it especially interesting, or I find the topic of the smart city especially interesting because it's an overlay of so many different topics. So on one hand, of course, space, then you have the layer of politics, then you have the layer of data, private interests, but as well responsibilities of planners, and of course the base layer, the democratic idea of the city that at least we here in Europe are still like chasing, let's say. So I'll just quickly go through what and why again. It basically shows where I'm coming from, what we heard already. In 2017, I started to, mostly incidental, I'd say, to stumble into this topic, and I wrote a paper with a dear friend of mine, Mariana Riobom, about big data in architecture. We both were interested in digital developments, and through the European migrant crisis, worked on a concept for strategies that enable planners to see where people are arriving and how they could be distributed like space-wise. So that was the initial starting point of my digital travels, let's say, and how I got in touch with the topic. And then I applied for an internship at Arc Plus that didn't really work out, but they somehow remembered my portfolio and that I sent in this paper. And after going to Switzerland to work there for a while, they contacted me again and we talked again because they were planning to do a digital issue. And that basically was the start of this black hole called Datatopia. It was really quite some work and the first profound contribution I was working on with this focus on digital and space. And then there were two more issues that followed. On the left side, you see the recently published property issue that is basically a combination of two German issues that appeared earlier. And it's connecting these two layers we heard before already, like the layer of property and land, and then the digital layer. I'll come back to that a bit later. So, and overall, as Julius explained before, I would say, or I tried to define these fields for me personally. I'm currently interested in these three research region, let's say. On one hand, I'm heavily digging into this technology, innovation, digitalization field, but I'm very interested in democracy, activism, and participatory processes as well. What can be seen as well in the way I'm doing or like understanding architecture, let's say. And another point that is not as visible yet, let's say, in my work, but I'm really interested in as well is the climate crisis, how we deal with resources and resilience. Yeah, but then let's really start with the smart city and what it actually is. As the wording itself is a bit blurry, I would like to start with definitions. And overall to the, or like if you want to get any resources I'm showing, just text in the chat, or I can send around the material I use later on as well. Yeah, I copied in quite some text. I'll jump through the things quite quickly. So the smart city in general is defined as an urban area that uses different types of electronic sensors to collect data. So we have on one hand the sensors, also the technological level that is tracking, and on the other hand the data. The European Union, as another part of definition, is mentioning two words that are marked in bold. Smart city means on one hand smarter urban transport. This word is quite interesting as well, because the word smartness is never really defined, so no one really knows what means smarter. And safer is another word that really comes up often. And there is this kind of triple layer of security, comfort, and sustainability that is kind of like mentioned again and again and again in the discourse of the smart city as a, let's say, big pro of this concept of the smart city. And if you watch the video, you can see, or like one point that was mentioned as, let's say, be aware of this naive idea is exactly that. This promise from companies that the smart city is gonna make your life just more comfortable. So it mentions, or like that's connecting these three very like reappearing words again, and sets it in this bit more critical context. And to give you an idea of, or like to understand better why this is critical, it helps a lot to go back to the technocratic understanding these technological companies are often looking at the city. I think you as theory interested folks already heard of cybernetics. So this general understanding that there is a system and you have an input and an output, and that basically everything can be calculated and is in a way predictable. So if you're interested in that topic, I can definitely recommend you to get this book and look into the CyberSyn project for Chile. It's a really nice example for this thinking model. But yeah, this thinking model gets, or like, yeah, that's another explanation of cybernetic thinking I added. And kind of like translating that into the here and now and into a more concrete architectural example, I would like to show you, let's say, the thinking model of Archilyse. I think some of you might already heard of the company. It's analytical approach to architecture, and they promise that they can, through their algorithms, they can predict how much profit the building you design, or like anyone designs, can make. So this is the very cybernetic thinking, I would say, that through, not only through analyzing, but in the end through creating the right set of a ground floor, you can predict how much profit you can get, how much quality of life you can have, and how you can get the highest quality of architecture, what is quite interesting, let's say. Yeah, look into the company. It's quite interesting how this guy thinks and how they approach architecture. It's quite horrifying to me, to be honest, because that implies so many next steps that come after this over, let's say, yeah, to like creating architecture only with this idea of getting the most profit out of the ground floor is per se a very neoliberal idea, but to argue that quality can be measured through algorithm, yeah, well, think about this point later on maybe. So this point of optimization in the smart city is as well connected with another base layer that is land. And I'll jump from that into platform urbanism and an example that I would like to show, to not talk too long. It's the smart city design of sidewalk labs. That is the perfect example of the up and downs that are currently happening on the market, let's say. So this project is actually dead already. They stopped it meanwhile, but it's a really good example for how big companies are approaching big urban designs, as well on a communications level. As you can see here, the plan communication is very childish, in a way participatory. Google as well created this blue container that you saw on the image before, where they made this center for participatory design, but it's kind of like, yeah, they invite people to take part, but of course only on a very restricted level. So the main decisions, or like the important decisions on infrastructure and what kind of data is going to be used, is already decided. So it's only, let's say, the facades or like the green space that can be influenced. And I added some questions that came from the team earlier. I think the most important thing when we're discussing about smart cities is how the data that is gathered and generated is used. Because the problem with Google and whomever else, like all these big tech companies designing our cities, is that they are privately using our data. So I got those questions already. So there are other concepts. So I'm not saying smart cities in general are bad, but we really need to think about what is happening and who's got the data and who is measuring what and what are the people going to do with that. So here's another drawing of the whole area. So you can see as well that it's quite a big project. And again, we're having this crazy childish appearance as well of the plan material. And to give it a little twist, or to come back to these different layers that I only digged into very quickly, I would like to show the Hong Kong example. I studied for a bit in Hong Kong as well, so I know the city quite well, and the political situation there is unfortunately really bad at the moment. But the city per se, or like what happened last year there, or since 2018, basically is a good example for these layers. On one hand, you have a very restricted area where everything takes place. So you have this scarcity of land on one hand, then you have this crazy digital layers, and then you have this government that is oppressive. And then you have all this technology happening in the city. So you can see the Hong Kong people in these images, how they fight technology because they are afraid of being filmed, being traced, and you have all these crazy devices that basically everywhere in the city, like for example, this lamp that they are tearing down, the lower image, they are full of sensors and can measure they're filming, of course, and then they measure a different set of data. And yeah, I guess you heard what's happening in the city now, that the government, or like the Chinese government, pushed through quite some legal rules that are restricting the protest further and further. So people are actually jumping back to very analog ways of protesting, because that is a non-traceable way, what is quite interesting. Yeah. So I rushed through my presentation so that we have enough time to discuss. And I hope you have some questions. If there's anything I should dig into more explicitly, let me know. Yeah, I'm looking forward to quite some exchange now.
Thank you. Thank you. I actually already have 5 questions or so, but before I start talking, could we go back to the image from Hong Kong for a second? The one where the yeah, exactly this one here.
Okay.
Well, we also use spray paint to blind the cameras. It's the most effective way to fight technology to go back to very analogous tools.
I would argue that it depends on in what situation you are. I think in this very oppressive situation that you can't handle it in another way because you're, I don't know, people are like governments are chasing you because you're on the street or you're whatever. This might be the only way, but before this level of digital surveillance happens, I think we definitely need to fight for open data, let's say, what quite some cities are already doing or trying to. And what helps as well, or what would help, is that people are more aware of digital developments. And that is a real problem. And especially in the planning level, let's say it's a problem. Because, I mean, I don't know how in your surroundings people are, like how much they know about digitalization. But I often have the feeling that especially planners do not know enough to like take part in the discourse as well on a democratic level. And it's on one hand, of course, like how much do you know? And on the other level, how much do you involve? So as well on this democratic level, it means that you need to get involved early enough. I mean, in the system of China, that's another discussion because it's not a democratic taking part kind of game. But especially here or in the Western world, it's super important to take part in the public discussions about these topics.
I think just one thing on the end of what you just said about this disconnection between planners and the technology. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that this is something which is, I think, increasingly evident in all fields relating to architecture. So there's a sort of this hyper specialization which has occurred that has broken up the practices of architecture, urbanism, planning, theory into compartmentalized groups that don't interact with one another anymore. And I guess this is, do you think that this is something which is, I guess, connected also to the system, the economic and social system that we live in at the moment, the political system?
You mean the disconnectedness?
The disconnect, this hyper specialization of functions. You know, everything is decentralized, but then each micro center functions completely autonomously, not autonomously, but independently from the others, and therefore there's technology, planning. Everyone has their own interests.
I think it's not only the topic of disconnection. I think often it's as well a question of complexity, because these topics are really complex. Like how, I mean, I'm reading a lot on technology and these kind of topics, and still it's really hard to understand. I mean, for me, still there's a lot that seems like a black box, because I don't know exactly how the technology works or how exactly the algorithm works. I mean, for some technology, we don't even know, like not even the experts know how the algorithms works, let's say. So I think one problem is knowledge, and yeah, the disconnectedness, that's definitely a problem. And like, I'm thinking about that myself a lot, especially in the planning sector, how to make people more aware. I think a big part is, of course, as well, the education, that we're not used to work interdisciplinarily enough. I at least can, because now the master's studies that I'm doing now are super interdisciplinary. So we have people from startup background, artists, economists, so it's super mixed. And the experiences I'm making now are just very different compared to my architecture studies. Because you need to find a new language. You need to explain things differently because the vocabulary is not the same that you have with other people. And I think this experience is missing in architecture or for planners, at least in education. So you're not used to how to do that.
But how much control does the architect actually have of these kind of big projects? Because the clients or these big projects, the smart cities, for example, in Toronto, they are developed by big companies. And is the architect actually involved? Does he has kind of power to develop kind of things or to change kind of things? Or is he, in this kind of case, only a service provider for the companies?
I mean, in the case of the Google project, the architects are only service providers. I mean, the image I showed her that is visible is a Snøhetta rendering, I think, the wooden part. So they are clearly architects, are only service providers. But for me, the more important question is, why are these companies doing the projects? I mean, it's obvious as well why they're doing that, because they have the power to do it. They are like economically strong enough to do it. But there could be a political layer that is saying, guys, you need to work for the architects that are taking more control, let's say, or that are more aware of what happens. I mean, that there are no offices doing it, that's one point, but that there are not, you can be involved as an architect on different levels, I would argue. And yeah, they're still lacking in this other positions as well. Yeah, I'm trying to push people to be more aware of it. So I think our generation is in the position to get self-aware about the topic and then get involved. Yeah, I raised the question in the description text as well, if it's not already too late or if we are still relevant enough to do so. But yeah, that's another question.
Well, I have too many questions. Two questions on what you just said. The first points towards the sort of visualization, which is mostly chosen for digital agencies or for virtual planning agencies of any sort, and it somehow always appears to be childish and intuitive and very, very easy to comprehend. Is there a need in digital space, because it's so complicated, to make it extremely easy to access and to comprehend, as they said, some sort of balancing the comprehensiveness?
Yeah, it takes away the complexity on one level, and on another level it adds this comforting happy land idea, I think. And is as well, like when you're looking at other participatory projects, you have that very often, that it's kind of like in a way playful or childish. And when you look at all this kind of startup-ish, I don't know how to properly call it, but there is a development as well in graphic design to make things more playful in a way. And I think it's a trend to show more comfort in a way, or to make people comfortable.
Because this is part of the comfort, security, and sustainability process.
Yeah, that's what I would argue, yes.
Yeah.
Are there other questions, actually?
Yeah.
Like, please feel free.
I would actually, thank you for your talk. I've just popped in. It's my first day here. But I must say I really enjoyed the talk, and I haven't actually read the full text, so I do have to apologize for that.
No
But I was really excited about when you again, I'm taking over the last two questions, because you showed these childish, you called them childish renders, which I thought was quite true. But it's almost like Instagram is doing to fashion what this kind of populist imagery renders of happy life is doing to architecture. Where are we ever, if this is the future, then architecture is almost inutile, like we're almost not needed anymore, where participation is the future. Like, you know, I have this image of before MySpace, where you would do your own MySpace, and you think that somehow you're a code, you know, an IT code man, and now Instagram, you're a model. Maybe the future is you're now your own architect and creator of space. So I was just wondering what your thoughts were on this kind of.
You're actually digging into my most favorite question. What the profession is gonna be in the future. No, but that's, I don't know how you, I mean, I guess everyone is an architect in here in this call. I don't know how you feel about the profession, but I had quite some moments within the past 2 years that, I don't know, where I felt very frustrated about where the profession is, what we are designing, how limited the pool of thoughts is, let's say. And yeah, if that is the conclusion you're drawing out of this development, you're asking exactly the right question. What I took, or like my way to deal with it, is to really dig into the topics and to try to educate myself and to look into other directions. And I recently posted as well the video interview we did with Arno, for whom I'm working for now. But we do kind of like have the same questions in the office now as well. Like, how are we gonna deal with that? Like, it's not only smart cities, it's as well the climate crisis. How are we gonna build in the future if resources are running out of, we're running out of resources, if we're running out of energy, if we need to adjust to this outer pressure points, let's say. So that means that we kind of like, or like, that's my opinion on that, that we radically need to redefine what it means to be an architect. But yeah, I didn't find an answer yet. I'll let you know when I know what it means to be an architect in the future.
No, but I think it's interesting that it's so obvious when we talk about image, the image of something renders. Architecture always work with images, that you call them childish, and then now to kind of re-question what, it's almost re-questioning the profession, what it is to be professional, and just to some extent be qualified in doing something, and saying, okay, well, I'm qualified to do that. Can you give me the benefit of the doubt? And I feel like this participatory system is almost like, you know, as if you had like, you wouldn't do that to a doctor. You would never say, are you sure? Let's ask some other people in the street what they think about this heart surgery. But for some reason, an architect has completely lost this legitimate, I don't know, stand somehow. But
maybe it's only that we need to look into different directions. And maybe, you know, it's like time to look into how do we collectively create space. I mean, it's obvious that I have a political position on that as well. And for whom I want to design, because I obviously don't agree with Achille Lüse that the solution is to hyper analyze everything. So maybe it's just time to start another way of designing. So if this surface facade client cover-up design is not the solution anymore, where do we look?
yes.
So that's what I'm discovering at the moment as well. Like where do I want to look as an architect, or like what are the topics I would like to focus on?
Very.
So, may I
jump in right here? I think I really like this question, and so thank you very much for your talk, which I also really appreciate. I think I liked it because you talk about the smart city, and I feel optimism and hope, and I like in a way in the critic. It's critical. It's definitely critic, and I understand it. But also, it's not just saying everything is bad. We should go back to the 20s, no? So this is it's nice to hear, because I think we need this optimism, and I think if I understood it correctly, it's also part of your work for the Biennale with Arno Brandlhuber. Now that you say we look at now from the future with an optimistic view, but I'm looking forward to see what you do there. And if I jump back to the question before, saying what is the profession of the architect today and what are we designing, I have this thought that if we look at the past, no, the profession of the architect was not to design housing. Housing was always built by people. So someone would go in and build his house, and the architects were maybe building public things or thinking about the city in a whole. But somehow the housing, maybe that's for me it's a big question. No, are we still designing housing, or this is maybe what we have to leave to everybody to design his own home? But where I wanted to go is especially this question you were talking about quality, no? Algorithm that are kind of working and then generating quality for apartments. But then I'm always wondering, algorithm are only working with parameters that you can calculate, no? Numbers, and something that you can say it's, I don't know how many square meter, it's, I don't know how many lux for lumen for the light. And then isn't it our task as an architect to be able to read more than something that you can count? And this is what I love when you arrive to a project and suddenly you can shift the project and turn it into something more that nobody could have calculated. And you realize that, I think that's what we learn when we study architecture, that we can understand a situation and turn it into something more, and understand it differently, like read it differently. And I think this is something that an algorithm could never do. And if I try to close my the cycle, and I go back to this optimism, and somehow the algorithm, all of this smart city, all of these sensors, everything, I think we should not be against it, but we should use it as an amazing tool for designing. No, so it's one more tool, so much things that we can use, and we have to kind of integrate into the design process.
Just move.
Yes.
Can I? Did you close your question?
I could continue for 15 minutes, but I think it's better that I stop.
No, I just jumped to a slide, or like to a question that was posed from the collective to me, or I always call you a collective. Sorry, but they're very collaborative. So there was the question: if architecture passed the point of this genericness, genericness fundamental to spatial planning. And what you just described, like that we could use algorithms as a design tool, or like hack them in a way so that we can properly use them to get more out of it, is definitely a point that I would want to make as well. So I attached the images again. If you're interested in that topic, I recommend you to look into this article, IE and Architecture. It's kind of like Ah, yeah, perfect. Okay, then you know what it's. Yeah, okay. So I'm not further explaining that.
No, maybe explain because I didn't read the article. Sorry.
Okay. It's a quite long article, but it's a nice description of how this algorithmic design works, let's say. So the process is you feed your algorithm with ground floor examples. And so it's like the algorithm gets a training set of ground floors. How does a ground floor work? So he learns to do. And then you can set parameters and tell the algorithm what you basically want. And then it's very simply explained. He's very profoundly doing that. So read the article. But you get a set of fitting ground floors for your parameters. So the point that I would like to make is that if we are able to use this technology besides this optimization hype, let's say, you could do the drawing work super easily and quickly, and then you could focus on what makes architecture such a nice experience, like haptics, like how does the space feel like, how we're, like all this nice stuff, let's say. So why not use technology to free yourself up from the drawing work? Or like that's at least a way that I could imagine that we could use these tools to really understand them as tools and then do the next step, let's say. Yes.
Yeah. Are there any other questions first? Sorry, I jumped right in. So, because when you say maybe technology will help us take away the draftsman work, and this somehow sounds like the first reactions to technological revolutions, when we were hoping for better things to come, and we relied on technology to take away all the service and surplus work, and human spirit should finally have time to find themselves. And is it actually realistic that we would eventually, especially in such a branch as building and real estate, we would have a profession just like architecture, not be mitigated, but be even elevated? I mean, most clients want us for exactly such work, for drawing up and not for doing too much thinking. And what are we left to do if we can't draw anymore?
Well, then we're back at the question, what is the real job of the architect? Is it to sit in the office and be the cut monkey? Really? I don't know. I doubt that very much.
Isn't this sort of what happened in the 60s with sort of what Archizoom and Super Studio were saying, with the sort of the industrial, what's it called? Yeah, industrialization of everything, leading to sort of the ultimate liberation of the worker. And then look at us now. We're just monkeys of consumption. So like, I think it's always very utopic to think, about relieving us of these. And we also have to always think about the context that we live in, because why is this smart city? What is the end goal of a smart city? It is basically to enable us to be completely and utterly devoted to then consuming, and because that's what ultimately they do with our data. They want to use our data to understand what our preferences are, how we behave. Yeah. And so I think the ultimate question is, what is the motivation behind the technologization of cities?
And I guess also how to use this kind of tools, if you use these tools also not only as architects, also as like a big company maybe, who want to develop these smart cities. When you use these tools in a good way and not only to make the most profit out of it or something like this, maybe it's a tool which you can use and which works quite well. But every time when I'm thinking about this, I'm thinking also about these bosses. How do they actually live? Do they believe in this kind of concept of the smart city, or do they still live in this old villa in the suburbs of the city? Like I was reading this novel by Niklas Mack. It's exactly the same topic. And in this novel, also this guy who actually is the boss and the developer of the smart city in Berlin, he's also living in the villa in the suburbs close to Potsdam. So when these guys really believe in the concept, like it's maybe a good idea, but they only believe in making money out of it, you know. And this is maybe the problem, because the tools are maybe great to develop something.
Well, yeah, and if I can add to that, I mean, we're mostly kind of here looking at this from a technocratic consumerism point of view, which already exists almost in our lives with our smartphones. We already know our data is being taken. I think we're kind of missing the romantic side of it. We're forgetting about culture and these other variables that inform what a city is. There's no such thing, I feel like, that can be a purely technically formed city. So I think adding on to Adrian's viewpoint, I mean, technology is something that is prevalent. It is growing and it is out of control, as you mentioned in your lecture. It was a beautiful lecture, by the way. And I think as architects, we come with the sensibility to understand, maybe not looking for a smart city, but a conscious city, something that could be socially aware, something that is sentient almost, because it's our goal to connect people to place, right? And we've been forever trying to do this better. And this is, of course, a ways that, I mean, it's dystopian, you know, it's a dystopian conversation, which is needed, I think, to fuel us in the right direction. But I think we can use culture to guide the technology, and in a way that's how we'd be doing our jobs appropriately.
I would like to jump to another question that was posed by the group. Yeah, I think it's this one. Exactly. They asked me if there were relevant examples of data being used for non-commercial or non-content related purposes or in grassroots settings. And yes, there are examples when cities are using their own data. So on a political level, the data is like, now it's not smart city, the discussion is not smart city anymore, but more how is the data that is available used. And there are examples like Helsinki, for example, that is gathering the data as a city itself. So the power of the data focused with a service. So I added this Brand1 article for all German speaking readers. So it's the potential of the open data that appears so attractive in the smart city can as well, of course, be used commonly. So that's what I mentioned before as well. It's not about that the smart city is per se bad, but it's about how the resources are used, let's say. And then there are more examples. Yeah, that's a quote out of their strategy. So they really want to activate their community, and they started projects like where people could alert on their phones with an app that there is something broken, and then the community started the repairing process. So things were optimized as well. So the same processes are used, but it's not with this idea of making profit or kind of like gathering data that is used, as was mentioned before, to create profit for a private company, but more to create an overall communal profit for everyone. And who is really interested in the topic, Barcelona is a really good example for that as well. Africa Bria is really doing great work on that topic. She's part of 2038 as well. And yeah, there's quite some interesting reading on that, there are quite some ideas on how to deal with that and how to do that. So it's really worth looking into that. And there's actually even a gathering of different cities that are implementing these ideas, but that happens on a political city-state level. And I would argue, to come back to this question of what we are dealing with as architects, that as well in this context, architects are very much needed to make to bridge this gap between space and data, or like the bridge between digital rights and space, or like especially these in-between topics. Architects are, I think, very much needed for these topics.
Can I have almost perhaps a incredibly fundamental question in response to what you've just said. I mean, I find this interesting to maybe hypothesize that architects should have some responsibility between this, like what you describe as a disconnect between, I don't know, the physical space and the data. First off, I was wondering if you perhaps could clarify if you have any idea of something that has been tried before in that sense. And then the second part of my question, or like the second question, I guess, would be is like, I mean, who is responsible for these smart cities fundamentally? Like, I mean, you mentioned this one in, I think it was Toronto or whatever, you had an example of this. This is, you know, again, who is responsible for these things? It almost sounds like in order for architects to intervene at this level, there needs to be more of a connection between architecture and real estate development. Maybe architects really should in the future fundamentally become real estate developers. Maybe like these lines maybe become more blurred in the end of the future, like if this is the responsibility that we hold as architects, because personally, to me, in my opinion, the way I see the profession of architecture from my own eyes is something that is indeed limited, as you have described before, and a bit frustrating at times, because there is like, depending on where you practice and stuff like this lack of engagement and hope to make change that is actually wished for at a very kind of like global scale, that how architects are fundamentally trained to think in the first place. So yeah, I guess my question really, yeah.
I'm trying to, the first part of the question is, are there good examples for this bridging already happening? And the second was, what do we actually need to work on as architects, in the sense of what topic do we grab? Yeah,
for instance, for the second part, my speculation is like this idea of, because the connection between data and space is so like fundamentally disconnected, but what like just physically speaking, but where the impact comes is more of a political engagement. And so we as architects have like this human understanding of these certain topics, but we're not able to implement them, like perhaps like in this literal concrete way that maybe is a bit abstract to me in my own mind at the moment. So that's why I maybe mentioned that connection.
Yeah, I'm starting with the second part because I feel like that's easier to answer, let's say. I would say, yes, you're totally right when you say, don't we need to become real estate developers in a way? Yes, you kind of like can see that already. If you're looking, for example, at the Haus der Statistik in Berlin, I don't know if you know the project, but that was taken over as well by a collective, let's say, and they formed a legal entity to really work on the project. And they are architects as well, but now they are like, you know, they're having this crazy huge participatory process running. And out of already young, hardly finished studies perspective, this might not seem like what you learned an architect to look like, but I think it makes highly sense. And if you're looking at other business models, let's say how architects work, like that, there are quite some architects that are their own developers, let's say, because it just gives you a lot of freedom. And of course, that means that you need to have the financial background, that you need the funding, that you need a totally different skill set because it's so much legal work. But that's definitely a point where you can influence. And the other part that you already mentioned as well is like political influence. And I think that's super important, that more people are starting to push into politics on this very topics of space. Yeah, but that's even more not architectural, let's say, but I hope that, yeah, that there might be more education on the topic, because I think that schools really need to change in that very aspect. Like currently in universities, these topics are, I don't know about your schools, but in my school, we were hardly talking about that kind of topics. And I think it's super essential that this is brought. That's as well why I decided to take part in this, because I think this discourse needs to take place, especially with young architects. And to jump back to the first part of the question, good examples, I would need to think about that in more detail, but you can often not so clearly identify them because it's often actors that are not as visible. And probably we need to find these actors and draw them to the front even more. That's as well a reason why I'm working in the PR section, let's say, or in the communications area, because I think as well the discourse or what we are talking about as good architecture needs to change. And I'm not sure if Katharina is still here, but as well with kntxtr, we're looking into different kinds of interesting architecture. When it's not only about these very nice buildings anymore, but it's as well about business models and how can I even have influence? Because especially for very young architects, or I don't know how it is for you, but I don't have the financial background to found my own office. It's just not possible because I'm not coming out of a rich family and I don't have the resources to work for free for a year. So what are the ways to create new forms of architecture? I think is a very contemporary question that more people need to ask as well in architecture media.
And it's very, very nice that we have such platforms as kntxtr. Hi, Katharina. Thanks for joining. Mm-hmm. And there's also something else. If we start talking about or what's been one of the themes of the evening so far, about the role of the architect, I feel that we're becoming more and more mediators, and that our perspective for the future is increasingly going to tend towards financial operations. So we have to be, this not necessarily mean that we're going to be real estate developers, or as you mentioned, being the sort of architect client at the same time is a very privileged way of doing architecture, but it means that we have to be increasingly aware of how much of the financial aspect lies within our profession. And maybe one of the solutions is to have this aspect in academia, but I also think that using platforms, especially in such a young age, for showing the different alternatives is as important as educating young architects on the importance of their future profession.
I mean, on the financial aspect, I don't know, this is a topic in the offices as soon as you reach a certain level of responsibility anyway. I mean, if you're talking about the precarious situations while doing competitions, how much pain in the ass some clients are, I mean, the financial aspect is already quite an essential part of the work as an architect. And yes, that doesn't do it in education, but I think the overall development of the field and of what it means to be an architect, I think that's something that is missing, because we're still like, the system is just rolling on, but maybe it's as well this generation missing in the schools, or like maybe they're already starting to work and implement these ideas. I hope so. But yeah, I don't see that yet.
Hi, I'm just going to jump in if that's okay. Thanks very much for your talk. I think this is an interesting question about the role of the architect, and I just wanted to say something real quick about this kind of use of the language of the use of the word architect. And here, I'm speaking from the UK, I know in our education, we were taught that it's really a way of thinking is what we learn about architecture, that your real USP is that you can approach problems from a different direction. And that's what you're kind of taught. And I think it's how we translate that to the reality of the job and how we put some kind of economic value on that skill set that isn't based around production. So, and I think this idea of, is there that kind of community in current universities? I think there probably is. I think the problem comes when people move into work. And how do you place some economic value on moral standing in architecture when most of the economic value is based on, basically on consumption? So for me, I think that's the real issue of the bridge between these thinkings. And just a real quick point of a kind of example, I think, between this qualitative and quantitative cycle of learning would be a reference of forensic architecture, the practice in London, of how they're really using this quantitative data to produce a qualitative output to potentially inform future decision making. I think is really interesting.
Thanks, Hannah. That's an amazing example.
Yeah,
it's really good. Yeah,
and that also that they're tied into academia as well, so they have a lot of influence upon the actual teaching.
Yeah, I think that's a good example as well to see how important it is to be active, or like to really communicate what you're doing. Because they are really, Eyal Weizmann is super active with publications and exhibitions, and maybe it's as well, like it's, you know, it's a two-sided business communications. So it's as well media taking up on things, but they were really active as well with communicating their knowledge, let's say. Yeah. Do we have some more questions? Can ask me anything.
Okay. Hi, hi at all. And first of all, I totally agree with you, Angelika, on so many levels. Feels quite nice. First, I want to say that something at the beginning, there was the question of if the architect has the power to change something, which brings us to politics, of course, and it reminded me on another big topic in the world of cloning and how medicine is changing the world right now, because at that level we also don't have that much influence, and it's kind of clear that if something is possible, people are going to do it. Maybe some of you saw the movie CRISPR Revolution. I saw it last year at the university cinema, and was quite interesting. Point is that, yeah, probably you don't gotta be changing that, but about architecture and about smart cities, the nice thing is that it's about location, and of course you can't change that, the point that it's gonna happen somewhere like in China, or maybe it's going to be in Hong Kong now, but we can still change how it's gonna be in our countries. And I see Shane has light, so we are quite international group here, which is nice. I just saw your post 2 days ago on Instagram. I'm following you quite a long time now, and I think what you are doing and what Brandlhuber Plus is doing about activism is quite the right thing, because first we have to make people aware of the whole issue, and going beyond architecture, our small bubble, and widening the topic. Yeah, I think that's quite important. I don't have a real question right now. Another point was that I'm really interested in the topic of computer-generated floor plans as well, and it reminded me on the work of Oliver Tessmann at the Digital Design Unit and his students, which were doing things like that. Quite funny that you came up with becoming a real estate developer, because looking back on my own development, I first studied real estate management, did an internship at a big real estate company in Berlin, which were kind of engaging in the gentrification of Kreuzberg, had a big project there, developing an old telephone fabric. Then Kreuzberg became hip and cool and everybody wanted to work there, and doing it to, transforming it into Zalando big office spaces. And it felt weird because I really liked the work there. I really liked some of the people there. Work was quite nice because you had this influence of law, of economics and architecture, but it didn't felt to do, like doing the right thing. And I still had this feeling like I'm really interested into architecture, and maybe I'm getting more to a point where I want to go by studying architecture. Now I just finished my bachelor degrees at TU Darmstadt, and now I'm here thinking about where I'm going, and thinking about going maybe to Euroboden, which is a real estate agent working, developer working with Mopedset and Brandlhuber. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for your comment. First of all, I think you're opening up a quite interesting field again. I mean, it's again about where do we go as a, or like where does the architect as a profession go? Yeah, maybe that's another, like way to go to develop just new forms of mixes of like real estate developer. I mean, you can see that as well in other business areas, let's say, that through the sustainability movement or through digital developments, there came new business models. And maybe it's time for architects to just think about what their business model is and how it's going to look like. But
and
that's
not only on the picture-wise points, like doing nice objects or pictures, renderings, but where it's going to be. Maybe another point, encouraging more people to go into that direction, is that looking at the real estate developers, there are so many, like the big companies, they're actually searching for architects. It's not an easy point to find a company where you can do something good, or like, yeah. You know what I mean?
I mean, we're still working in a capitalist framework. So yeah, you're like this ideas of over analyzing and optimizing floor plans that doesn't come out of nothing. But I think it's definitely good to have an idea what they do and how they do it, to develop counter models. I mean, I think, or like I'm a super optimist even in these crazy times. I think it's essential to understand the mechanisms and then to hack them and to use them for the good. Otherwise, I would be super depressed.
Can I
yeah, but
say
I think
something?
there must be a way.
Sorry, thought you had finished. No, I'll let you finish. Can I?
I guess your connection is poor.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm here. Okay, one thing. Just made me think about Adrian's question earlier about how we use technology and these algorithms for sort of things that are about optimizing and things that are, I can't remember the word you used, but that are to do with parameters that are quantifiable. But could you not argue that today, with the fact that we give out so much of our data, so much of our preferences in terms of what we like on Instagram, what we look for on Google, these things that sort of touch into our more phenomenological subconscious, could you not argue that these algorithms could, I'm being polemic here, could you not argue that these algorithms could actually allow us to predict our feelings, in a sense, the way we feel, the way we prefer certain things to others, because of the amount of data that we are giving in that sense?
But these kind of like testings are already being done. I think we had one artist work actually in, I think it was in Datatopia, from a artist in Hamburg, where they measured, I mean, of course, face measuring is something different than you just described, but there are already ways where you can kind of like translate feelings.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, there are this very famous tests as well where they know things before you know it,
yeah,
because your heartbeat raises or that kind of stuff.
So I guess what I was saying is that the argument of saying that the architect is not obsolete because we still need to design for these aspects of feeling, but actually in reality we have that technology already to do that for. So our role becomes even more obsolete in that sense, that we don't even have that element to contribute any longer.
I think what you're describing is especially interesting in the context of designing very specific floor plans, like this kind of like home smartness, when you're talking about what happens at home, at what time, for example, that is measured through the smart devices that you have at home.
What about preferences of materiality, preferences of the sort of furniture we like, the way we, furnish our space, preferences, and how much time we spend in the garden, to having an external space and stuff like this?
I mean, WeWork, I don't know how they're doing at the moment because their stock crashed quite a bit, but they did that already for workspaces. They analyzed who went where at what time of the day, who used what space, and then they adjusted that. So this knowledge is already there and it's being produced, and companies are using it.
Exactly,
so
that's the thing, ultimately.
I actually want to pick up on that question from Gino. I'm interested in newness and the correlation with big data, because big data, as Gino said, and Facebook was a good example where advertisement at the beginning was kind of random and there was be random advertisement, whereas now it's very precise. And I was, if we were to do big data designing, your floor plan would be somehow designed according to your preferences. Would we not be directly influenced in terms of contemporary culture by technology and the ability for it to completely understand you? And in some ways we'd have no impact in newness, and newness would be in some way how good the big data is and how relevant, if that makes sense.
You need to reframe what is exactly the question, if it makes.
So how long will the big data take for it to be good enough, for it to create a floor plan that is individual enough for the person and not for the universal person?
But wouldn't there, because if we're thinking about that the data is basically always available, so you have real-time data, the question would be more like in a future scenario, let's say, would be more how quickly can the floor plan adjust to what I need?
Yes, without having to go through the entire 2008 till 2015 where we had advertisement about anything, whereas nowadays it's very specific because you went to search for something. So like you can see that big data has improved and it's becoming much more about me being interested in a product. How good would it be? I don't know, how long would it take in a way, or how long of a bad architecture would we have to go through before the floor plan gets to something very unique?
But Alex, I guess there are already like architects developing at the moment. I guess what you also said, Angelika, they're developing these kind of things. And I guess in 1 or 2 years, like we should ask the companies if they like it or not. Because like my old professor from my bachelor studies, he developed these programs in London, and he used this kind of programs also for companies. And it took a while because they were really researching the company. They were also going into the company and asked the employees and all this. But it could be quite interesting. Maybe it's much better than without this data. Huh? Like maybe the office works quite well, and the people. Yeah, sorry.
Can I add on one point? I think from this hyper specification of space or hyper individualization is gonna stop due to resource limitation. I think I don't believe that we're going this very steps until the last possible moment, because we can't afford it from a resource perspective. But it's highly hypothetical, this discussion, to me. But I think that the pressure from the climate crisis is going to increase like pretty quickly within the next 10 years, let's say, so that there will be this leveling out of what can we do on a technical level and what can we do on a resource level, is, I guess, stopping some developments that go in that direction. So it's going to be way more attractive in, like, my future idea, I think, is that it's way more attractive to have more neutral space that can be adjusted in a more flexible way because it's neutral, than to have this hyper individualistic space.
I agree so much with you. Don't you think sometimes it's highly funny that we ask computers to design houses when we can do it so well as architects? Sometimes I feel like it's I don't know, it's like these people using computers to cook pasta. I don't know, sometimes it's too much, no? Maybe this use of data is relevant in a larger scale, but in the scale of a home or even of an office space, for me it makes almost no sense. But then I wanted to jump on I think what you said about resources, and there's this amazing article from Garrett Hardin in Sciences in the 70s or 80s. I would say 70s, no 80s, when he was explaining, it's called The Tragedy of the Commons, and he explains already in the 80s, he talks about climate change, and he explains that we always try to find technological solution instead of changing the habits.
Yeah,
and I think this is also something that a computer cannot understand. No, it's about, and I mean, I'm saying this also completely influenced by Mukpetset because I'm working with him in Mendrisio. But it's about being in a place and understanding those that cannot calculate. And what you said, that somehow maybe the shortage in resources is going to, I mean, if I understood it correctly, that is going to have an impact on this technological development of architecture. I could completely understand it. And I think that when we talk about the role of an architect today, it's so clear. Look at our world. There's so much to do. And we have this possibility to propose projects, to propose different ways of building, of living, of working. And this is so amazing, this task that we have. No?
I would like to add one more example to what you said in the very beginning of your point, like this, that we don't even allow like life to happen in a way because we're over defining everything through the computer. Like Netflix reintroduced, or like you push the watch button and then he gives you basically analog TV. Like he proposes you what to watch because people are missing the feeling of just, you know, experiencing what they get. And I think that's a super important point, that through this kind of like curational mode that we have in every part of our life, that we can decide what kind of things we're consuming on this hyper individualistic level, I think what is coming back in a weird way is letting things happen, or like that's at least what I hope for, that there will be this new curiousness about just let it happen, and then we'll see what we get. I think I totally agree that this over controlling and over defining is as well exhausting, because you need to take so many decisions instead of taking the situation and dealing with what you get.
And you have 25 on your iPhone to control your complete life. You have to say how many degrees your apartment is going to be when you go back home, and so on. I mean, sometimes it's just it's overwhelming.
Yeah, it's as well this kind of like self-tracking people are doing with on their bodies, let's say. You're losing your feeling because you're trusting the machine to tell you how you feel like. I mean, it's crazy in a way when you think about it that way. But
and at the same time, you send your data to your insurance company to raise your taxes.
Yeah. Yeah, no, very good point. Thanks for adding that.
I have a little anecdote to just add to that. I'm currently coming to the end of my quarantine. I've been locked in for 2 weeks because I was in Sweden and I had to quarantine coming back. And obviously they threaten you with fines if you leave the home, and being a bad citizen myself, obviously I left the home. But the amount of anxiety, I've been leaving my phone at home so that if for any reason they can track me, they see I'm at home. But it's liberating, you know, when you're outside and you don't have this device on you and you actually notice things that you didn't notice anyway. But yeah, little anecdote, I think.
Yeah, as I mentioned before, I think I'm pro technology, I would say, overall, because I think it enables us to push into new directions. But it's definitely worth reflecting on how you use technology and what the limits are onto the where do you want to use it. I think that's super important.
I mean, maybe in the end, even the smart city was not so much about the smart city itself, but about a new enlightenment, making the citizens smarter than before and becoming aware of the technology and the way the data are being processed. It's a final utopian thought, but might be a bit stretched.
That was nice. Yeah, hello everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. I would like to quickly get back to the beginning of this conversation, when the smart city have been defined in several ways, but one of the definition was, let's say, this juxtaposition between a political layer and a digital one. And honestly, instead of calling it smart city, probably we could call it panopticon city, in a way that also related to what we talk about afterwards, about Hong Kong and how technology combined with on a physical space can be really oppressive or totalitarian, let's say. And in this case, just remind me how it bumped into my mind how basically the city's physical layer, where a biopolitic as a tool of governance is occurring. So this combination of a political layer and a digital layer, in a way how it's developed, I have a little bit of feeling that really remind me about some discourse that Foucault made back in the days and actually is occurring. And biopolitic, I mean, like exactly, or assume is the meaning that Foucault gave. So it's the ability by, let's say, an apparatus, a government, to control and give the rhythm or life of its citizenship. And this is just a reflection. There is no question, actually. So the other point I would like to underline again
It's about something that Adrian before at the beginning said about Wohnung, about housing, and the fact is, yeah, it's true. Back in the days, probably a great majority of housing units were built by normal people, so just someone own or occupy a piece of land and start building with local resources their own house. This idea of being yourself architect, it can be really appealing, but in my opinion, can be also dangerous because give you, let's say, false idea of freedom and awareness what you're doing, not because architects are per se better person than or more, let's say, aware person about space compared to normal citizens, but because I really believe that housing, or generally speaking, buildings, works in relation to each other. So if it's missing a little bit of this general idea how the single cell, the unit, create the image and also the let's say the form of the city. So and also again, I would try to be really quick, and this is the third point, why housing is so important and should always be maybe our main focus, or among our main focus as architects, because 90% of the urban fabric are houses, and 95%, I don't know, the great majority of architecture nowadays, or even residential building, I guess, are built by loans. And this connects as well with the one of I think Stanfest something, sorry for names, but I just wrote down it really quickly. When we at the beginning we talk about this software that is able to calculate the profit you can make depending on the plan. So it's basically a way to calculate the return of investment, just optimizing the plan. And I don't know, it seems that is really leading to a point where architecture is not anymore something related to architecture as a discipline, but it's something totally heterogenetic directed, in a way that at the end everything is reduced to calculating if what kind of a return you can have designed in a certain way. And what's controversial in this, that in my opinion is considering the plan, but we always know that spaces are also made in elevation, and elevation is something that probably we don't consider, or in a way that if we need to ask a loan to build something, the bank doesn't want to know exactly how the elevation works, probably just want to know how many square meters can sell in the market. So yeah, it was just like a generic consideration.
I would quickly like to add on to your last point that, like, the question of are they only looking at the floor plans or as well the elevations? Like the Achilluse team is doing 3D model analysis, so it's like highly detailed material and data sets that we're doing. Just to add on that information, it's not only the floor plans that they're looking at, but the overall building. But yeah, of course, I'm as critical as you about this analysis tools.
I have a quick question regarding, you think you gave an example of the Helsinki open source data, and I wondered if there was any kind of negative backlash from that, in terms of with every technology comes, for example, the 3D printer comes the 3D printed gun. And so in many ways, making the data open source, I wondered if that data has been used yet in a way that wasn't seen as positive.
For Helsinki, I don't know it actually. I didn't check on the project. But that's a really good question. And I don't know currently if they had any real bad experience with open data sets. But the way you can enable, or like you're accessing the data is quite, so you need to go through a certain process, and then you're only getting this anonymous data sets, let's say. So you're like the government makes sure in every case, as well in the Barcelona case, that there is only this meta level of data that people can access. I moved to another slide because one of the questions, and I think that's quite a good example for the for what you just asked, like the bad examples of the smart use of data, or like good or bad, is the tracker apps that are currently developed for corona tracing. I added one article on that. So the question was, will this data gathering through this corona tracing apps lead to a final blow on private data, or is that gonna demand a legislative reform on how we deal with privacy and surveillance? So yeah, well, I just grabbed this article, and what is quite interesting is that even if data is anonymized, you know what I mean, that you can track back the data through a combination of a certain characteristics, like yeah, that's what the numbers say here, percentage of individuals, like 99.9%, that one study found could be re-identified within 15 demographic characteristics, even when their data was anonymized. And I think that's a super interesting point as well, and of course will be, or is to be thought about super intensively. And I only know it for the German app, actually, that they made an enormous effort to really decentralize the servers where they're storing the data, and to get an app that is really highly secure, but still you're giving your data to someone, in that case the state, or like the service they are using, that could be misused in a case.
In this case, it was actually Google and Apple that, so they decentralized. So in the UK, the app didn't work. So now, I mean, I didn't even realize, and I went onto my phone, and if you go in the health app, you now have a COVID-19 tracker in the health app, and I never agreed to, saying it. So I think it's this decentralization also leads to lack of accountability from, and decentralization of accountability to corporations rather than state actors, who then have responsibility on a different. So it's kind of like blurring the lines of who owns that data and who has the power to do.
That definitely, but one point that needs to be added is that when you're looking at your phone and looking at your apps, then you most probably already installed 15 apps that are sucking more data than this coronavirus apps. It's like, especially when it comes to the German app, that's definitely the case, because there was quite an outcry, a public outcry, because German people are very afraid of data breaches, that they didn't want the data to be used. But most of, like this discussion was around this one app, and everyone, like people are already installing WhatsApp and whatever else apps that are already sucking this data. So that, like, especially on the Corona app, in the German case, like the Google and Apple case you're describing is a different situation. But when it is about the state developing apps, and then this private company forms are developing apps, you really need to, yeah, I don't know, have kind of like value the effort of the state, because in Germany there was really an effort made to get this running, and then see how you're using other apps. Mm-hmm. Sometimes I have the feeling in the discourse there is kind of like this, people are jumping on these topics because they don't exactly know what's going on, but they heard, there could be a data breach and the state is having my data, but they didn't realize that they already gave away their private data for another, I don't know, game or whatever else app. But that's, yeah, already very technical discussions here. Hannah, I definitely didn't answer your question, but thanks for posing it. I look into that, and if in case I'm sending around the present, or you're sending around the presentation, I can add material that gives examples on this city level if I find something.
I think we will send around the presentation. We've also received some questions from people around the world to get the presentation. Oh. And I think they were all very happy to have the extra material. As we're slowly reaching our 2 hours approximated time limit, we try to keep it to 2 hours. May I ask for any final questions or final remarks to pose to Angelika or anyone else?
Quick ones, quick ones.
Another question as well, that's fine. Thank you very much for your talk, Angelika. I liked it a lot. The only thing I was lacking was the activism that you mentioned briefly that you were interested in as well. I always very much admire that in the Hong Kong people, that like the resistance they gave. And I've never seen anything close to that in Germany. And so my question would be, how do I at least not participate in a negative way? When we all have to use these services every day, Google and Apple, and we all have to work for money. Yeah.
I'm trying to answer the activism part first. As you said, you lack that, and how, or like I understood it as a question, how can you participate, let's say? It might not be the fight for like, or tearing down censors, let's say, but there are enough cases in Berlin, I don't know where you live, but here in Berlin there is quite an active activist scene where you can get involved. On one hand, there is currently the fight around the Hermannplatz with René Benko heavily investing in Karstadt, interesting people on the street. So you can partake in real protest, let's say. And then there was recently the eviction of Syndikat. That is another very famous, at least in Berlin, eviction case where Pierce, a huge London investor, bought a building, and then they evicted a community-based bar that was there for like 30 years. In Berlin, I would say the activism happens mostly in the field of housing, not so much in the technological smart city level. If you would rather get involved in city development, then look into Syndikat and what the people around Raumlabor are doing, because they're super active. Or if you are interested in more of a technical level of how you could get involved, there are quite some Baugenossenschaften. But that's then more the property topic. So it might not be the Hong Kong protests, but these protests there are due to heavy governmental problems, let's say, or like their political situation there. So I would argue we can be really happy that we don't need to push as hard on the streets at the moment. But yeah, there might be, or like it's definitely worth joining protests on housing topics as well.
It always is. So Angelika, thank you very, very much for this evening and all the insights we have. I think we've got more than enough topics to continue thinking about activating our profession.
Yeah, thanks for having me here. It was a pleasure. If you're interested in what I do, follow me on Instagram. Sometimes I'm very active and sometimes there is nothing happening. But yeah, there are quite some things going on. Or read up on kntxtr. There's quite a lot of discussions going on, and yeah, as we say in German, bildet Banden, connect with other architects, exchange opinions, exchange on the topics you're interested in. I'm super happy that you're doing this because I think it's super essential to have people, get people connected and have this exchange. So thanks to you and thanks everyone that joined. It was really nice.
Thank you very much. All the others we're most likely going to meet again in